Hi again, everyone. Great to see you again. This is Minji shooting this lecture from Tallahassee, Florida. And I'm really happy to announce that this will be the last pre-recorded lecture, mini lecture that you'll be asked to watch. So congratulations on getting this far. In this mini lecture, I will be covering the basics of what's called the local inclusionary housing programs. But this, to place this in context, in this week, we are covering the breadth of solutions that have been developed by the local governments to combat exclusionary zoning practices. So inclusionary housing programs have been one of the most widespread and one of the more efficient ways of combating exclusionary zoning practices. So let's get to it. All right, so like I mentioned, this is part of the week where we're learning about diverse local solutions that have been developed, devised, and employed to combat exclusionary zoning practices. And in this week, you are asked to be split into groups and be assigned to specific topics, specific solutions, local solutions, and delve deep into those solutions. So instead of doing a mandatory pre-recorded lecture for everyone, we decided to take that route because of the variety of solutions that are out there and the depth of academic and industry and academic and industry research and knowledge that have been accrued around the efficacy or the problems and problems of the local solutions that are covered this week. So we want for the group to focus and dive deep. And so one of the groups are actually asked to study inclusionary housing programs in more detail. But since this is such a widespread approach, or widespread solution, we have decided, Dr. Garcia and I have decided to create this mini lecture on inclusionary housing programs so that we can, there's a baseline for everyone that you need to know at least the basics of what this is and what are the basic parameters of inclusionary housing programs. But again, there are additional materials that are available for the group that will be assigned to inclusionary housing programs. All right, with that being said, so what do I mean by inclusionary housing programs? So I mean, when I say inclusionary housing programs, I mean any variant of either local policies, ordinances, or programs that requires the developers of market rate real estate, commercial real estate. Most times it is applicable to residential component, but some places actually do it apply for commercial as well. But anyways, stepping back, any type of local policies, programs, or ordinances that ask the developers of market rate commercial real estate development to build affordable housing. And what I mean by affordable housing is income restricted, deed restricted housing as part of their development, market rate development. Or offer the option for the developers to make a cash contribution or other types of contributions that could be used for creating affordable housing. And so I made this point earlier in one of the lectures that inclusionary housing programs are often referred to as inclusionary zoning. And this is because inclusionary housing programs have been developed in response to the exclusionary zoning practices that we've been covering the whole semester. But inclusionary housing programs are not always found in the zoning section of the local ordinance. And a lot of times they are found in the housing ordinance and in the general local ordinance. Sometimes they're even enforced as a mayor's executive order. So I would encourage you to use the inclusionary housing program as opposed to inclusionary zoning. All right, so let me delve deep in or straight into some of the examples of inclusionary housing programs. And I'll start with the simplest example, and which is from Denver, Colorado. And one point that I do want to make is that inclusionary housing programs have many labels, and in Denver, it's called Moderately Priced Dwelling Units Ordinance. And so I'll talk about that diversity again later in this lecture. But again, anyways, so in Denver, it's called Moderately Priced Dwelling Units, and what this ordinance says is that for any new development over 30 units or more, and for sale project, they should set aside 10% of their total units, total market rate, total housing units as affordable. And this affordability in this per this ordinance is defined as affordable to households earning at or below 80% of AMI, adjusted for household size. So that's what the Denver ordinance is, and it allows for some flexibility. So if it's a high cost structure, such as high-rise buildings, then the developers can increase that income eligibility to 95% of area median income. Denver ordinance offers alternative ways of meeting this ordinance, complying with this ordinance, such as the offsite, providing affordable units offsite, or contributing into the fund so contributing to making monetary contributions to an affordable housing local fund. And these are very common alternatives found in almost all local inclusionary housing programs. Denver also offers incentives in return for asking for the affordable housing units. So for example, it offers up to $25,000 per unit per moderately priced dwelling units that the developers will be building. And this direct financial subsidy to developers is not found as often in inclusionary housing ordinance. So that's somewhat of a unique feature of the Denver ordinance, although not unheard of. But anyways, this is an incentive that's being offered in return. But also the developers can ask for a density bonus, parking reduction, expedited permitting processes as supplemental incentives. And these are very common incentives that are oftentimes found in inclusionary housing programs. All right, switching to Boston, it has been called the Inclusionary Development Policy in Boston up until, well, it's still called Inclusionary Development Policy now. But so the reason why it's called policy is because it is policy. It's the mayor's executive order that is enforcing this policy. Last year, I believe, the city submitted home rule petition to the state legislature and asking for authorization to create a local inclusionary housing program, and they did. The state legislature approved that petition. So Boston will have a formal inclusionary housing ordinance in the coming years, or if not months, but that is to be seen. Anyway, so inclusionary housing policy in Boston has been put in practice in 2001 by former Mayor Menino, and it applies to any projects that are over 10 units. So that's a pretty lower threshold requirement, if you recall the Denver example, which was 30 units. And any project that's over 10 units that requires, and there's a qualifier, that requires a zoning relief or amendment. However, in Boston, almost all projects have to require a zoning relief or amendment to get built. And that has been intentionally kept that way. And there's some history to this zoning regime, which I discuss in the paper that is cited here, which was published in 2020 in the Journal of American Planning Association. And this is one of the papers that we ask you to go delve deeper into if you are assigned to analyzing inclusionary housing programs. But anyway, so coming back to the Boston example, in practice, almost all projects that are over 10 units have to require either zoning amendment or relief or both in almost all instances. So all projects that are over 10 units are essentially subject to inclusionary development policy, which is the vast majority of any new development that's happening in Boston. And so Boston's inclusionary development policy requires that 13% of total units are set aside for either 80% or 70% of AMI, and the 80% of AMI or 70% of AMI is applicable to rental projects, and then 80% to for sale. So it's both for sale and rental, which is different from the Denver example. And then if the developer decides to do an off-site compliance option, they have to provide more units to up to or at minimum of 18%. So there's some disincentive in doing the off-site option. And then when it goes to the payment option, the payment scale, there's 3 different payment scales depending on where the project is located within the city. So if it's located in a very dense hot market section of the city, then the developers are required to pay the highest amount, versus if it's located in the outskirts of the city and in a cheaper area, then they can provide or contribute less. All right, so this graph on the right shows the number of affordable housing projects that have been promised by all approved projects and then all building permit issued projects. So the building permit issued are the concrete numbers versus the approved projects are there's some uncertainty in terms of whether or not the project's going to move forward. But anyways, you can see that the Boston program has been fairly or highly actually efficient in terms of getting actual units built on the ground. And this graph does not capture the monetary contribution. It is simply calculating or tallying the actual units that have been promised and actual units that will actually be built in by the market rate developers. So it's it's been a highly effective program in creating affordable units in the city, and you can read more about it in the paper. All right, now example 3, which is the most complicated example that is found in Seattle. So last year, or I'm sorry, this is not last year, a couple of years ago, Seattle enacted what's called the citywide upzoning, which was increasing maximum height and density in all areas, neighborhoods, and all land of all city land. In return for increasing this maximum height and density, the city also created a mandatory inclusionary housing program. So the city used to have an incentive-based inclusionary housing program where developers can opt into creating affordable units or making a contribution if they, in return for getting additional density and other incentives. But again, in that paper that I mentioned just before, it has not been that efficient because of its voluntary nature and because of its limited scope in terms of geography. to make an inclusionary housing program more efficient and meaningful, the city undertook this citywide upzoning, and it was informally referred to as the grand bargain in the city. You're essentially bargaining density and height in return for affordable housing. So I describe this Seattle model as very complicated because the mandate, the set aside, and the set aside essentially it varies considerably depending on where you are located in the city and how much of a density and height increase that you got or the neighborhood got through the citywide upzoning process. And also note that the affordability requirement in the Seattle case is very low. So if the units are very small, they need to be reserved for 80% or 40% or below area median income households. If it's greater than that, it's 60%. But having seen a whole gamut of inclusionary housing programs, these are very low affordability requirements. I mean, not low, deep affordability requirements. All right, so this table is what I mean by the complicated nature of the city. So as I said, depending on where in the city you're located and how much of a density increase bump that you got through, or that the neighborhood received through the citywide upzoning, that the developers are subject to differing levels of set-aside requirement and commensurate payout option, which ranges again from 5% of the total market rate units to 11%. And the payout option is also highly variable, ranging from $7.64 to 35.75 cents. I'm sorry, and in areas that are that have the hottest market, and also that those areas that also received larger bump in density and intensity and height. So that's how the Seattle program is structured. And so essentially, I want to bring this slide, to sort of bring everything together. So as you have seen, perhaps by the breadth of the examples that I just described, inclusionary housing programs come in many different forms. And there are many design options that can be, that cities can opt into or decide to go with. And so first of all, there's that threshold question, what is the threshold requirement that the projects will be subject to this local inclusionary housing program? Is it, 30 units, 50 units, which is the case in Tallahassee? Or are there some sort of trigger qualifier that, so if, for example, a project requires a zoning amendment, is it going to be automatically subject to inclusionary housing? So those are some threshold questions. And then there's also the question of for sale versus rental. You saw that in both Boston and Seattle, it's both for sale and rental, versus in Denver, it was for sale. In Tallahassee, it was for sale. So there's that option. And so in Tallahassee, it's over 50 units and just for sale units, which has created some issue with the actual, efficacy of the program, because for example, downtown multifamily developments that have like 300, 400 units, very expensive market rate multifamily apartment developments have not been subject to inclusionary housing program in Tallahassee because of that for sale requirement. And that 50 or more unit requirement has also excluded or exempted a whole gamut of projects that have been coming to the city. Anyway, so moving on to the next design option would be the mandatory versus voluntary option. So some cities, as you've seen in Seattle, it's not mandatory. In Boston, it's sort of framed as voluntary, but in practice, it's mandatory. In Denver, it's also mandatory, but a lot of cities actually have, and more cities have voluntary than mandatory inclusionary housing programs. Which means the ordinance is designed in a way that developers can opt into providing affordable housing, income restricted affordable housing in return for the incentives that are being offered. And in that case, developers will essentially go into balancing exercise of whether or not the incentives outweigh the cost of providing affordable housing. Moving on to the next design option, there will be compliance options. So there's on-site option, and these are, almost all programs offer all of these options. So is it going to be on-site, off-site, or payment in lieu, or land dedication? But keep in mind the Boston example that for off-site, there could be a higher percentage, or for payment in lieu, you can have cities can have a differing sort of levels of payment. Next, there's an affordability requirement, depth of affordability requirements, or I'm sorry, the set aside percentage, also depth of affordability. Is it going to be, 10% affordable, 13, 15, 18? And is it going to be for affordable? Should it be designated for 60% of AMI, 80% of AMI? A lot of programs actually have the moderately priced dwelling unit-ish middle income housing as housing model as well. So in those programs, maybe it's up to 120% of AMI. And then there's the length of affordability, how long should projects be subject or units be subject to deed restrictions? And in Tallahassee, it's 30 years. In Boston, the initial affordability period is 50 years, but the city does have the option to extend it to another with another 50 years. Some cities in Vermont have in perpetuity affordable units, or in the case of Sarasota County in Florida, it's only 10 years. So what does that mean in terms of the impact of the inclusionary housing program if it's going to be applicable, or if it's going to be affordable only for 10 years? And that at the end of that tenure, the owner, or either the owner or the renter, I guess it's the owner of the building, can either rent it out or sell for market rate units, which will be a huge value creation for the homeowner or homeowner. So there's that affordability option. And then finally, there is an option to choose the scope, the geographic scope of this program. Is it going to be citywide? Is it going to be neighborhood specific? Is it going to be, tied to a neighborhood, planning study? Or are you going to have multiple actually inclusionary housing programs within one city because that are tied to planning studies? So all of these design options can be combined and create, and which can get pretty complicated fairly easily, and so which is why you will find cities and local governments with multiple inclusionary housing programs. So some of them, so for example, one program would be applicable for citywide, and then there could be area specific, more like higher standard inclusionary housing programs that offer additional density for additional inclusionary housing. So it is not that, so multiple programs can exist in one jurisdiction, and that every single inclusionary housing jurisdiction's inclusionary housing program will differ from one another because of these design options. All right, so these are some well-conducted nationwide surveys of inclusionary housing programs, and which you could go into, and especially the one by Faden and Wan. If you go to the appendix of this publication, there is a summary of some of the most prominent inclusionary housing programs in terms of their affordability. All of the design options that I just covered are also the examples are actually summarized in the 2017 publication by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And then most recently, Wang and Balakchandran, Dr. Balakchandran, who just joined FSU, which I'm really proud to say, has conducted a nationwide survey of inclusionary housing programs in the United States and has just published their paper in June of 2021. And so you will find great insights from these nationwide surveys. All right, so I'll leave you with that. Thank you for your attention. I hope this was useful. And again, this is not to go into this lecture is not intending to go into the details of the program and its efficacy and all of the academic studies that have been conducted on inclusionary housing programs. This is only to walk you through the basics and to give you a clear idea of the parameters of inclusionary housing programs. All right, I will close this lecture with that. Thank you.